morning, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that get us to think about ourselves, our community, and the world around us in ways that get us connected, and perhaps inspired or challenged to do just a bit more because we made that connection. Our show today is part of the Jewish Voices series, and today we'll be focusing on Israel and the war in Gaza. Our guest, Ilan Goldenberg, is a senior vice president and chief policy officer for J Street, and he served as the senior advisor on the Middle East to the Vice President Kamala Harris. He is a foreign policy and defense expert with extensive government experience covering Iran's nuclear program, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and the broader challenges facing the Middle East. And prior to CNAS, Mr. Goldberg served as the chief of staff to the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the U.S. Department of State. And we have John Orenstein as my co-host today. And he is retired from his practice of law after 38 years. And at the end of 2022, bid that adieu. He was born and raised in Minneapolis and St. Louis Park. And John went to Oberlin College and Columbia Law School. John is president of Bethel Synagogue and currently the chair.
I will say I'm the past president.
Oh, there we go.
It was 10 years ago.
Okay. The Bethel Synagogue and current chair of the Minnesota chapter of J Street. And Kit Bix is the co-producer of this show. She is a journalist and longtime liberal activist and a retired academic. She's the lead producer of our Jewish Voices series.
Hi, Ilan. We are just absolutely thrilled to have you here, and really looking forward to hearing your views. Thanks.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
And Ilhan, we've given some thought about where you start a discussion like this. It seems the natural place is to note that we're almost 2 years to the day from October 7th, 2023. And any discussion of what's going on now has to acknowledge that what happened on that day was a savage attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians. It was horrifying. It was full of atrocities. But at that time, I don't think we expected that 2 years later we would still be witnessing a response by the Israeli government led by the Netanyahu regime and by the Israeli military, a response that is frankly morally indefensible. And that's where I'd like to start with you. Do you agree with that assessment? And if so, what are the implications for American Jewry, for American progressives, for our country, and for the world? You can pick any of those.
Sure. And yeah, and again, thanks for having me. And it's a very important place to start. 2 years on from October 7th and that horrific day, and now the horror that we're seeing in Gaza. I would agree that what is happening at this point is morally indefensible and needs to end. And maybe what I'll do is I'll start with actually what is happening on the ground and a little bit in terms of implications for Israel and the Middle East, and then also like what it means for American Jews and progressives. I mean,
Sounds
I think
good.
and on the ground, what we are seeing is the challenge that we're essentially seeing is 2 years on, the Israeli public has turned against the war, right? You've got 70% of the Israeli public wants this war to end. You have a situation where Israeli national security officials, over 500 of them, have signed a statement saying that there's just no benefit to Israel anymore to continuing this fight. Palestinians are obviously suffering in really horrific ways. We've got over 60,000 Palestinians dead. You've got incredible challenges with getting aid into Gaza, and now you have a new offensive that's begun. All of this is really, at this point, mostly just to perpetuate Netanyahu continuing to stay in government. Like, I was in government in the aftermath of October 7th, and the first thing I did was start working on leading a response out of the White House on what does planning for the post-conflict look like for the day after. Because what we figured out very quickly is you need a plan. Not if you want to defeat or replace Hamas, you need a plan for what comes in instead, political and security structures that come in instead. We learned this in Vietnam as the United States. We learned it again in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you just fight militarily and you have no actual plan to, replace and actually create a new kind of leading entity in the country you're dealing with, in the situation you're dealing with, you're just going to play whack-a-mole. You're going to keep killing people. The insurgents are going to go underground, and then they'll come back when you leave. And that's what's happening now 2 years into the war with
Absolutely.
Gaza.
I commend you for thinking about needing to have that solid vision. What does it look like?
Yeah, exactly. And so Israelis are kind of just stuck at this point. Palestinians are stuck. The Israeli society and government is stuck. And part of the challenge is the only thing that can replace Hamas that's credible and viable is Palestinian, something that, at the end of the day, this extremist Israeli government is against. They don't want to see a Palestinian alternative in Gaza. And precisely because they don't want to see a Palestinian alternative in Gaza, they refuse to have any serious plans for what happens afterwards. And the war just goes on and on and on.
Can I ask you something, Ilan?
Yeah.
You're talking correctly, I think, about what the Israeli government seems to want.
Yeah.
Here in America, at least until recently, we always thought we would have elections coming up. And in Israel, what I've heard in my little knowledge of Israeli politics is that eventually there will be an election in 2026, and that the Israeli public is not so hot on Netanyahu, and there might be some change. Does that give any reason for hope that there will be a window for change there?
Yes. I think there is going to be an election in Israel in 2026. Because of the nature of the Israeli system, we don't know exactly when it will be. My guess is it'll be in the first half of 2026. It's not supposed to happen any later than November 2026. Same time we have our own midterm elections. And Netanyahu for 2 years now has been polling far behind, the alternative coalition that would come in. That coalition isn't going to solve all the problems. First of all, it has to win. You never know. Second, that coalition includes a wide variety of people, including people who really want to pursue something like a two-state solution, people who really want to move forward with the Palestinians, and others who I would call kind of never Netanyahus. They aren't necessarily like where, for example, J Street is, and where I think a lot of Americans and American Jews and more progressive folks would like Israel to be, but they're better than Netanyahu, and they have at least committed to ending the war. And so that would be progress in and of itself. So that opportunity is coming. And I do think it's a really pivotal, that's a historic election. Because if after all of this, Israelis re-elect Netanyahu, I think Israel is just on a very, very, very dark path. And I also think at that point, you started a conversation with, what does it mean for American Jews? And we never really got to that part. I got distracted a little bit by Israel. But I think American Jews are, much more liberal than their Israeli counterparts. And, are watching all this with heartbreak and finding themselves increasingly isolated and detached from Israel. But still a lot of love for Israel there. I think if you have Netanyahu win again, I think a lot of American Jews and Americans generally just going to throw up their arms and say, forget it.
As an American Jew, we talk a lot about something that we see in our own lives, a sort of generational divide. It seems at times that the liberals on Israel in the American Jewish community are the age of, we're baby boomers, right? And our children, we're very proud of our children because they're advocates for social justice, but their idea of social justice more and more seems to be that they're anti-Zionists. What do you see out there?
So, look, I think what J Street tries to do is hold what I would call the liberal Zionist position, to not walk away from Israel, to continue to believe in that idea of, essentially a world where, Israel can be a secure Jewish democratic state that lives up to founding values, consistent with the Jewish values, and where Palestinians can also have their rights to freedom, security, and self-determination. I think most people still believe that and still want that. Certainly, I think most American Jews do. But, especially this new generation that's come up and is just, seeing Netanyahu and has really grown up just seeing an extreme right-wing Israeli government and leadership for 15 years. Like, they don't get it. You look at the baby boomer generation, really saw Israel through that lens of, developing country, underdog, right in the aftermath of the Holocaust. I would call myself, I'm in the Gen X generation, right? Kind of on the border of millennial Gen X, right? Like, I grew up with the Israel of the 90s, like really wanting to make peace, aspiring to be better, the Oslo period, right? Whereas, the folks coming up behind me, all they see is Bibi.
I really appreciate you sharing about J Street and as a senior policy officer. I loved how you were able to give us a sense of what the message of J Street is. And you also had some ways that you were thinking about in an article I read recently, that the ways that Congress and the U.S. citizens can work to make a difference and ways that J Street are advocating.
Sure. I can tell you about a couple of specific pieces of legislation and actions that we are really pushing right now. Maybe three things. One, we're really pushing on something we call the West Bank Violence Prevention Act, which has got a lot of support in Congress. There's a version in the House and in the Senate now, which really looks at extremist settler violence in the West Bank. During the Biden administration, we, for the first time, imposed sanctions on these extremist settlers who are not just committing acts of violence, but also really pushing Palestinian communities out of their homes, and sometimes with very little enforcement or opposition from the Israeli government. They're not part of the Israeli government, but the Israeli government hasn't really done enough to stop them. And so now we have, we had these sanctions in place in the Biden administration. Donald Trump, early in his administration, removed those sanctions, and we're now pushing Congress, to reimpose those sanctions. Through legislation. And in the House, we have over 80 members of Congress who are already supporting this. In the Senate, we're just starting, but I think we'll get a lot of senators. And so really continuing to push on that and calling your members of Congress, calling your senators, telling them to join the West Bank Violence Prevention Act. That's a big one.
Ilan, do you think you'll get enough Republican support to have this legislation pass?
I mean, to be honest with you, almost certainly not. I mean, this is one of the challenges of this issue. However, that things have become so partisan. However, what we are doing is setting the baseline and the bar for Democrats, which also matters a great deal because, at some point, 2 or 3, we're going to have Democrats take the House, hopefully in 26, maybe the Senate, and just, even going into 28 and the next president, if we have a Democratic president, like everything we do sets the barometer for this debate of what the expectations are for that president. So J Street's philosophy and approach is like piece by piece. I think in the last 15 years, J Street has really dramatically changed the conversation in Washington on the issue of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's one step at a time that has kind of happened.
Well, I'm excited that you'll be coming to the Twin Cities. I understand that you'll be here on October 8th. And John, you want to share a little bit about that program?
Yes, it's at Temple Israel on October 8th at 6:45. Temple Israel is offering a series on perspectives about Israel, and the kickoff event is what one might call the liberal perspective that J Street represents. Ilan will be part of a moderated discussion with Rabbi Marcia Zimmerman. Afterwards, there'll be a reception where Ilan, assuming you stick around, we'll all have a chance to talk with you a little bit.
And it's free of charge.
I'll plan to stick around.
Yeah.
Oh, great. We would love to talk to you.
There will be food, and it will be free of charge.
Even better.
Amazing.
It is free of charge, but you do need to register. And to register, it's at templeisrael.com/events. And stay with us. We'll be continuing this conversation here on Connections Radio on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. We'll be right back. Good morning. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. And I'm glad you've joined the conversation. Our show today is part of the Jewish Voices series, and today we'll be focusing on Israel and the war in Gaza. And we have Ilan Goldenberg, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer for J Street. He also served as the Senior Advisor on Middle East to President Kamala Harris. Kit Bix, our producer. Karen is a journalist, longtime liberal activist, a retired academic, and lead producer for our Jewish Voices series. Thank you for all your work.
You're welcome. Hi.
And our co-host is John Orenstein. John is past president of Beth El Synagogue and current chair of the Minnesota chapter of J Street.
Thanks, Laurie. Ilan, we talked a little bit last time in the last segment about your work as an advisor to Kamala Harris. You, of course, advised her on the campaign on Mideast issues as well. And after that, it seems there probably were any number of things you could have done, but you chose to come to J Street in a senior position. I'd like to hear more about why you did that, of all the things you could have chosen to do.
Sure. Thanks, John. And what happened was, and how I would say it is, look, I was working for Kamala Harris first on the presidential campaign, or before that at the White House in the response to October 7th, and frankly was pretty burnt out by the summer, ready to go do something different, was going to leave and go do, spend more time at home with family. And suddenly she became the nominee, and I got this phone call, and I ended up on a presidential campaign doing politics, leading her effort in terms of reaching out to the Jewish community. Not something I ever expected to be doing as really more of a policy nerd. But what I really took out of that experience was, first of all, really appreciating how traumatized the American Jewish community was by the aftermath of October 7th. Something I had not really fully comprehended, even though I was working on it at the White House, mostly working on what's happening over there, how we deal with the policy, how we end the war. In this role, I was really understanding what was happening in the United States. And the other thing I also really took out of that experience was this understanding that after October 7th, what happened both with Democrats and with American Jews was this really polarizing moment where in the aftermath, you had one group that went very hard right. We're going to support Benjamin Netanyahu no matter what. Another group that went very hard left and was accusing Israel of all kinds of terrible things as early as October 8th. When the reality is, and those were the loudest voices, and the reality is, overwhelmingly, people I talked to, American Jews, Democratic voters, didn't believe in either of those two extremes. They really believed, look, we have to be able to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. Israel, of course, should have a right to thrive and exist. And at the same time, Palestinians also deserve their rights. October 7th was a horrific terror attack committed by Hamas. And I'm horrified by what is happening in Gaza right now. And the more I understood that these were actually the overwhelming majority, but also that these were the voices that were not being represented enough in our public discourse, in our dialogue, that is what I really took out of the campaign experience. So after the campaign, I slept for a couple months, time with my family. I taught my daughter how to drive. That was a very important achievement. And I thought about what I wanted to do. And it really dawned on me, I wanted to represent that central voice, those, the overwhelming majority on these issues. And once I figured that out, J Streets just became the natural platform for which to do that, because that is ultimately what we do, whether it's lobbying in Congress, starting chapters all over the country through our own media, social media, representation, speaking, engaging. It's just an incredible platform for doing precisely that. And that's what I've been trying to do since. And it is a moment for J Street. We've really expanded in terms of size and reach across the American Jewish community because this is where most people are. And most people are, and they're finding increasing dissatisfaction, frankly, in some other Jewish communal spaces where they used to be, where this conversation can't happen the way it needs to happen, and where they feel that they can't have these honest discussions where they can both talk about their love for Israel and, their pride in Zionism and at the same time, like real horror about this Israeli government and what it's doing, often in their name. And I think it's really important to distinguish between American Jews and the Israeli government, and even between Israeli people and the Israeli government, since this government is so unpopular at this point. But there's also no question that it's having an impact on how Jews are viewed around the world. It's having an impact on how Israel is viewed. And so that's all of that, challenges that have come since October 7th. That's why I'm just very proud and excited to be at a place like J Street.
We're glad that you're doing that kind of work. And do you find that there's more? I used to think of J Street as primarily, and maybe it still is primarily, an advocacy organization, but you have what you call a communal spoke. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that that's developed more in the last couple of years?
Yes. In terms of reaching into the community, I really think, look, J Street used to have a much narrower lane overall in terms of the people that it could reach out to, given all the nuances and the different Jewish organizations that existed in different places in the community. But increasingly, in the aftermath of October 7th, what you saw is a lot of organizations just rally behind the flag in Israel. And so did J Street, I should say, especially at first, right? But then as time went on and this war went on, and it just became just increasingly made so little sense and seemed so conflicted with so many of our values and so many Jewish values. What we've seen is a lot of these organizations have stuck with the position of we're not going to criticize and we're going to supporting Israel is going to be supporting Bibi Netanyahu. And what it's actually done, I think, is really created a huge opening for us. And maybe the best example actually is our students, the J Street U chapters around the country. Right? We have 60 of those at different universities. And these kids, they are holding this really hard middle ground. They are not the kids out waving Israeli flags and supporting this government no matter what. They're also not the kids who are at encampments. We actually have a disproportionate number of them are rabbis' kids, right? They're kids that love their Judaism. It's deeply part of their identity. Israel is a part of their identity. And they're really just seeing what's happening and think it's not really consistent with their values. And we create this space for them. And it's just an example of how J Street's influence is growing and how that space for people who want that precise conversation in the Jewish community is growing. Our budget has doubled in the last 10 years. Our membership, or 5 years, our membership has doubled in the last few years. It really is a moment because people don't want to give up on Israel and the American Jewish community, but they also just can't tolerate things continuing to go as they are.
When I think about the students, as you mentioned them, particularly under this administration, and anti-Semitism that abounds, unfortunately, and then how that impacts the broader agenda, how it impacts how you work with the students, how it impacts how you're working with all. We live with all kinds of issues of anti-Semitism, but I have to believe that it's even more challenging now as we have this administration. What are your thoughts on that? Sure.
Yeah. Anti-Semitism, look, we had a surge. Anti-Semitism has been surging on the right really for the last 10 years or so. And in the aftermath of October 7th, we've also seen a real surge of anti-Semitism on the left and really this crossing of lines where many times what starts as harsh criticism of Israel crosses over when you start blaming American Jews for the Israeli government's behavior. That's anti-Semitism. Harsh criticism of the Israeli government, whether I agree with it or not, that is not anti-Semitism. You have to be able to draw and define that line, and it's a very hard one to draw and define sometimes. And what you've seen in college campuses since October 7th is both a lot of very legitimate, sometimes over the top, but still legitimate free speech criticism of Israel. And then at other times, you have seen a crossover into violence, into swastikas being drawn on doors, into things that, into students being really isolated in progressive spaces or called out, Jewish students, and that is crossing a line. And it's become a lot more challenging. I will say, when I talk to students, and especially these J Street U students, they are so interesting, and I've done some talks on campus. They are really holding that middle ground and are able to engage with all the different communities. And their view is they haven't experienced, they've seen that surge. They haven't personally experienced that much of the rise in anti-Semitism. What they have experienced is a rise in having to have a lot harder, more uncomfortable conversations. Then you've got their parents and people who are not on campus who are a lot more, I saw this on the campaign, like the students are a lot calmer about this than their parents are. It's the parents who are really like freaking out about what's happening on campus, even if they're not necessarily on campus. And then you've got the Trump administration walking into all this. And this is a big problem, and you see it across the board. And they are now using real concerns about anti-Semitism to do all kinds of things that are not about fighting anti-Semitism at all.
Exactly.
Whether it's taking hundreds of millions of dollars away from universities, whether it's trying to shut down free speech, whether it's using it as an excuse to deport people. That is none of that. That's about the Trump administration's war on liberalism and on academia. That is not about anti-Semitism. And what you hear, by the way, we have a lot of polling that shows the American Jewish community overwhelmingly opposes this approach by the Trump administration. And what you also hear from students is like, this is hurting me and it's making me less safe. Because when Donald Trump starts making everybody's lives like worse at universities and saying it's in the name of the Jews, like that actually fuels more anti-Semitism. And they also, other thing they talk about that I found really disturbing is increasingly students being afraid, especially international students, to speak up and say anything on campus on this particular issue. They're just terrified they're going to get deported. And so it really is having an impact on speech on campuses, which is just so sad because like campuses are like that. Like if there's a place in the world where you should have the most flexibility and free speech, it really is campus, right? Where ideas are and universities are really meant to kind of thrive and be creative. So yeah, it's been hard since October 7th. I feel like it's only gotten harder since Donald Trump became president. And
Trump using it as justification for things that are far from our Constitution.
Yeah. I mean, it's also one of the things that's really important for J Street to be in this space because we need Jewish organizations speaking up loudly in progressive spaces and proudly saying this does not represent us. This is not what we want. This is not how we fight anti-Semitism. And so there's a lot of Jewish organizations that are doing that, whether it's J Street or JCPA, Jewish Council of Public Affairs, the Nexus Project, but there's a whole group of Jewish organizations that are really standing up because Jews have always been part of the progressive coalition. I mean, Jews voted for Kamala Harris 70%. Like these are our allies. And they've been voting 70% for Democrats for years. And so we want to send messages to our allies and like, we're still there with you. This is not okay or something we support.
On that subject, just a quick question that hopefully generates a quick answer. After October 7th, it seemed to a lot of people that their allies on the left weren't particularly sympathetic. Did you see that, and how has that evolved since then?
Yeah, that's also true, right? Like, so this has been one of the very lonely and challenging things for American Jews, is that a lot of the different institutions we're used to counting on haven't really been there for us the way they've traditionally been there. That involves the Israeli government we've talked about, that involves the American government with Donald Trump. It also involves American Jewish community leadership that oftentimes has kind of given Netanyahu a blank check or supported him. And it's also meant a lot of progressive allies who, were not there the way we were hoping they would be there after October 7th. And a lot of American Jews who have felt really lonely going into progressive spaces that they've always considered, places of allyship in the aftermath. My hope is that it's getting better. I actually think, maybe it's a little weird, but the Trump administration is creating opportunity to rebuild some of those bridges because it's finding us things to work together on.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, but maybe that's the silver lining.
Well, we're excited that you'll be coming to the Twin Cities and we can continue our conversations with you, Ilan. You will be here Wednesday, October 8th, and I'm going to have John share a little bit more about that program.
That program will take place at Temple Israel on that day at 6:45. It's part of a series that Temple Israel is offering, trying to bring the voices of different perspectives in Israel before the Jewish community. Happily, the first voice will be Ilan's, representing what we think of as a liberal perspective. Rabbi Marcia Zimmerman will moderate that conversation. There will be time for Q&A from the audience, and also some time for a little old-fashioned schmoozing afterwards at a reception where Ilan will still be there.
I hear there's food.
That's been rumored.
We'll be looking forward to having you there as well. It is a free event, but you do need to register. And to register, you can go to templeisrael.com/events and register. We'd love to see you there. Thank you again, Ilan. We appreciate your insights, your guidance, your hope for the future, and call to action for us to be truly progressive partners. And we appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And with that, I hope our audience will stay. We'll have one more segment coming up, and we'll be discussing more about perspectives in connections and how we can grow connections through being inspired to do just a bit more. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and our show today has been part of the Jewish Voices series. And today we focused on Israel and the war on Gaza. We have had the pleasure of being able to have some terrific people as part of our series today. We've had our guest, Ilan Goldenberg, is a senior vice president and chief policy officer at J Street, and he served as the senior advisor on the Middle East for Vice President Kamala Harris. We have our friend Kit Bix, who is a co-producer. She's the lead producer for our Jewish Voices series. She's also a journalist and a longtime liberal activist. We're delighted to have her here. And John Orenstein. John is a past president of Beth El Synagogue and current chair of the Minnesota chapter of J Street. And delighted to have all of you part of our show today.
Very glad to be here. And Ilan, it's a pleasure to talk with you. I want to talk about something that has been associated with J Street for many years, maybe even is considered central to J Street, and that's the desire for a two-state solution where there would be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Lately, that is maybe for the past couple of years, it's been fashionable to say that that solution is impossible, it's dead. For J Street, though, it seems that it's not dead, but we need to talk about a different sort of solution that still involves Palestinian statehood. Can you expand on that a little bit? What is J Street for these days?
Sure. So, look, we're still for the two-state solution. But the reality is, as John, you said, so many people are frustrated or disillusioned at this point. So we've started talking more about it in terms of what we call the 23-state solution. And the reason we talk about it that way, what we are talking about is Israel at peace with the 22 Arab states that surround it, and the creation of a new 23rd Arab state, the state of Palestine, that would also be part of that agreement. And the reason we talk about it in this context is that there is a lot of momentum and interest by many of these Arab states in making peace with Israel in a way there wasn't years earlier. But it's also true that they aren't going to do it without meaningful progress and eventually like statehood for Palestinians. And so this is why we've really honed in on this argument of the 23-state solution. Now, how do we get there from here? Because it feels like, oh, my God, the situation is as horrible as it's ever been. How do we get there? I think the first step is we have to end the war in Gaza. What you need is a deal that ends the war in Gaza, all the hostages come out, and you flood Gaza with a lot of aid and humanitarian assistance. We need that to have happened yesterday.
And who does that, Ilan? Who floods
sure.
the aid?
I mean, who floods the zone with aid is that's the entire world. International community, Arab states, the United States, with support from and enablement by Israel. And I think the key, though, is during this first phase, you're also going to need, I talked about it a little earlier, to create a security mechanism in Gaza. Eventually, that's going to be the Palestinians and local Palestinians, and you start training security forces to do that. But you're going to need an interim force to come in, and really it's going to have to be an Arab-led interim force. So you bring the Arabs in temporarily, the Arab states in, to do that. You also have them working on really what would be an interim governing solution for Gaza, which would involve Gazans, Palestinians from Gaza, Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, all these different elements together. And eventually what you want to see is elections that reunite Gaza and the West Bank. We can talk a little bit about the West Bank too before we stop, because a lot going on there also we haven't talked about. But, again, and eventually you get to Palestinian governance in Gaza and the West Bank. Eventually you get to Palestinian security control with help from the Arabs, and huge investments beyond just humanitarian aid to rebuild. All those are steps along a pathway towards like Israel and the Arab states working more closely together, and Israel and Palestinians working more closely together, and eventually you get to leveraging that into what we call the 23 state solution.
Where does Hamas fit into there, if at all?
Sure. So, look, this is how you've already had the Arab states come out very publicly in a declaration a couple months ago and say, this is the pathway we want to see, and the Europeans are supportive of it too. And in this pathway, Hamas cannot have a role. And Hamas, needs to disarm, needs to step away. Hamas has already agreed to give away governance in Gaza, right? In any deal. They understand they can't govern Gaza. Question is, they will still be there, and there'll be a lot of local population backlash against them. And if you can create alternatives from a security and governance perspective, I think Palestinians will go to those alternatives. This is what we've learned, again, from basic counterinsurgency 101 in the history of these kinds of conflict. If you create viable, effective, credible alternatives, that's how you weaken the entity that's actually holding power. So this is how you do that. And, I think that Hamas would do this deal because their assumption would be like, well, we can weather this and we can still be in Gaza. And Israel and the international community would do this deal because we believe we can actually create a real alternative. And then it's going to be ugly. It's going to be messy. It's going to take a long time. But there is a history of being able to create these alternatives. We've done it in places like Syria where, ISIS really does not control territory anymore. Part of the reason that's happened is because you've been able to work with local actors to create an alternative. So that is how you're going to have to do it. It's complicated and it's hard, but there's just no alternative.
It seems it would require different leadership in the United States. Just a mild understatement.
Yeah, and different leadership in Israel. And frankly, ultimately it's got to be the Palestinian Authority who controls the West Bank who's got to take it over too. And there's a lot of challenges for governance for them and new leadership that's very necessary there as well. So you need a lot of new leadership in all places. I think you got elections in Israel next year. Palestinians, I think that comes with time and, with the U.S.
What did you want to say about the West Bank? It could be that people haven't heard as much about it because Gaza has been taking over the news.
Sure. And really that is a fundamental change. It used to be that all the focus was on the West Bank and not Gaza. And since October 7th, it's flipped. But yeah, I was actually in the West Bank about a month ago on a J Street delegation, and things really are getting pretty horrific out there too. Since October 7th, you've had a real crackdown on movement of Palestinians. You've got these extremists, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, ministers in the Israeli government who are supporting just settlement activity at unprecedented levels, talking about starting to annex territory. And so part of what we've been doing at J Street is trying to fight against that through a series of measures. I already talked about the West Bank Violence Prevention Act. We're currently, I think there's a letter going around Congress to really object to annexation. And, just continuing to raise the alarm on this. It's also part of the reason why you have this push towards recognition of a Palestinian state, which J Street is supporting, and which many, European allies, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, are in the process of recognizing something that originally they said they wouldn't do until you had a deal that actually had two states. But I think that the recognition is things are getting so bad, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, that you have to do this now as a way to infuse some hope, as a way to create some credibility, to continue to signal to the world that, you're committed to this. And the other thing about this statehood question is also it's important for Gaza too, because all these Arab states who are saying we're going to go in and help you in Gaza and we want something better there are also saying we're not just going to invest again and then have it all blow up in another war, which has happened before when they've invested after previous wars in Gaza, none of which were nearly this horrific. And so part of what they are saying is, we need to see moves towards statehood. We need to see a Palestinian state as part of this process if you want us to take real leadership and ownership for what is happening in Gaza, in addressing what is happening in Gaza.
You said earlier that the surrounding Arab nations are interested in making peace with Israel. It touches on the geopolitics of the region, doesn't it, in the sense that you got to ask yourself, why are they suddenly interested in being friendly with Israel? It's kind of a shift. Is the shift due to Iran and the desire to box in Iran?
I think the biggest shift is a recognition that stronger relationship between the U.S., which they all really want, this helps them with the U.S. So their number one priority is actually the American economy. All these countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, have all kind of realized we have a huge amount of oil money. We can invest that money. We only have a few years before eventually, the global economy starts to move away from oil. We want to turn that into investments in AI and green technology and the generations of that's what they want to do. And who is the best partner to work with in the world on that? That'd be the United States. Israel's also good. They've got a lot of technology and are quite successful. And I think they know that peace with Israel just improves their political standing in the U.S., improves their relationships with us. So that's maybe motivator number one. But more than anything, they also want stability in their region. Frankly, I think for a long time, Iran was viewed as a destabilizer and Israel as more of a stabilizing force. I'm not sure that's the case anymore after the last couple of months. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, we had the strike in broad daylight in Doha, in Qatar, taking out Hamas negotiators and leaders. I think the Gulf states are also looking at Israel as a major destabilizer at this point after that, not just Qatar, but also Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the war between Israel and Iran. So they just want the region to cool down. They want good relations with everybody, and they want to be able to really focus on what's most important to them, which is fundamentally shifting their economies so that they can, be successful into the future.
We only have a couple minutes, and I have one final question for you. And that is, in our last segment, you talked about the disappointment of some of the progressives that weren't there, that you hoped that would be better partners and better supporters. We have a lot of good liberal progressives that listen to this show. What ask can we make of them so that we can be better in supporting the needs of all Jewish people?
Sure. So I think it's to start by thinking of American Jews as, as a minority, the way you think of every other minority. Yes, we are American Jews have, Israel is in a position of power versus the Palestinians, right? American Jews have been incredibly successful in this country, right? And so, whereas you give space for the feelings and of other minorities and groups, sometimes you don't give that sensitivity to American Jews. But American Jews have also just been through a history of trauma. It's the Holocaust, but it's the hundreds of years even before that as an oppressed minority. And so, trying to be sensitive to how Jews, felt after October 7th, being sensitive to these concerns about the fears they still have, that are part of the driver of this conflict is, I think, and expressing that empathy and sympathy for pain that they are also feeling is, I think, also just a way to show allyship.
Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us today. And I know you're going to be coming out, and you can get tickets to a program that's going to be on October 8th at templeisrael.com/events. We so appreciate you being here. Thank you for producing, Kit. Thank you for co-hosting, John. And we have to say goodbye because I've got 4 seconds.
Bye.